It was the year 1923, deep within the forests of Brazil, surrounded by dense trees and unpaved paths. There lay a village called Hoer Verde, home to nearly 600 people. It was a quiet but lively place. Children ran through dirt roads with bare feet. Fathers repaired tools. Mothers cooked over open fires. Roosters cried with the morning sun, and the smell of fresh bread drifted between simple wooden homes. But on this particular morning, there was no sound. A postal worker named Luis Ramos was the first to notice something was wrong. He had delivered mail to Hoer Verde for years. He knew the rhythm of the place. The barking dogs. The old men chatting near the schoolhouse. The clang of pots echoing from kitchen windows. But now, as he approached the village's entrance, there was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, only the soft rustle of wind through the trees. He stopped at the first house. The door was open. Inside, a table was set, plates filled with half-eaten food. A cup of tea still warm, clothes neatly folded in the corner, a radio quietly humming static. But no one was there. Lise called out, "Ola? Anyone home?" No answer. He stepped back, heart quickening, and walked to the next house. Same scene. Food on the table, shoes by the door. A baby's toy lying on the floor, but the house was empty. Completely empty. He moved from house to house, street to street, each one abandoned, but not in a hurry, not like people had fled. It was as if they had simply vanished. When he reached the church, its heavy wooden doors creaked open. Candles had burned low. A Bible lay open on the altar. The pews were neatly arranged, but no priest, no parishioners, no sounds of prayer or footsteps, just stillness. And then, on the wall, carved into the wood, was a sentence, burned in black letters. "There is no salvation." By noon that same day, Luis Ramos had returned to the neighboring town of Francisco Badaro, his face pale, hands shaking, voice hushed. He told the local officials what he had seen. No one believed him at first. Villages didn't just disappear. But Luis was a man of habit, a man who never exaggerated. And so, just before sunset, a small group of 4 policemen and 2 soldiers mounted their horses and made the slow journey to Hoer Verde. They arrived by dusk, and they found exactly what Luis had described. The village was still, perfectly arranged, eerily untouched. Fires had gone cold, yet ashes were fresh. Plates remained half full. Chickens wandered the yards, hungry but alive, and yet not a single human. As the team moved through the village, their boots echoed on wooden floors. Some houses had chairs knocked over, others had beds that looked freshly slept in. There were no signs of blood, no forced doors, no struggle, no noise, just emptiness. In the schoolhouse, notebooks sat open on desks, math problems half finished. One chalkboard read, "Test tomorrow, bring pencils." But there would be no test. The team searched the forest edge. No footprints, no wagon trails, no signs that 600 people had moved. They counted livestock, found them all still penned. They checked wells, cellars, even attics. Nothing. At the church, the soldiers stood in silence as they read the words again. "There is no salvation." Carved with a heated iron, burned deep into the wood. One officer whispered, This feels like they were taken." Another replied, "Taken by who?" They set up a temporary outpost in the village square that night, but none of them slept. They reported strange noises, whispers, footsteps that stopped when followed, and at one point, the distant sound of a woman singing, yet no one was there. The next morning, a decision was made. They would call in reinforcements. The mystery of Hoer Verde was no longer just a local concern. It was something else. Something that made even trained men afraid to stay too long. The village was sealed off, a perimeter set, but nothing ever came in. and no one ever came out. 2 days after the soldiers' arrival, the Brazilian military dispatched a formal investigation unit to Hoer Verde. It was no longer considered an odd village incident. It was now classified as a potential national security concern. 600 people had disappeared, without a single trace. The investigators were men in dark uniforms, not police, not standard army. They spoke little, took photographs, measured door frames, collected samples of the food, the soil, the well water. They moved like people who had seen strange things before. Locals were warned not to enter. Barriers were set up, and in time, Hoer Verde was removed from maps. Officially, it had become a restricted zone. One of the few reports that ever leaked from the investigation scribbled by a field technician and later smuggled out reads. No signs of resistance, no bodies. It's like they all got up and walked into the fog. Another added, every clock in the village stopped at 4:47 and all of them. Exactly the same time. In one home, on a kitchen wall, a strange metallic residue was found smooth, cold to the touch, and unidentifiable. In another, a child's journal was discovered. Her last entry read, "The air is humming again. Mama says to stay inside. But the light is coming back tonight. I hear it in my head. What light? What hum?" The officials never explained. In the following weeks, the case was sealed under federal order. The village was abandoned, blocked off, forgotten, but some officers who had spent time in Hoer Verde ... changed. Quiet men. Restless, they spoke in fragments, suffered from insomnia, and avoided certain words like salvation or fog. One of them, before vanishing himself, reportedly wrote in a journal, "It wasn't an evacuation. It was an erasure." Hoer Verde was no longer missing. It had become a ghost, a name whispered in closed rooms. A story passed like smoke through hands. Weeks passed. Nature began to reclaim Hoer Verde. Vines wrapped around doorways. Wind carried dust across abandoned rooms. The jungle, slow and patient, began to erase the human traces. But the silence never lifted, and neither did the fog. It wasn't always there before, not like this. Now, a thick gray mist rolled through the village almost daily, creeping in at dawn and vanishing by noon. It muffled sound, blotted out sunlight, swallowed shapes and shadows. The few researchers who were allowed back into the site after the military closed it off all reported the same thing. You can hear voices in the fog, but they don't come from outside. They come from inside your head. One man, a geologist named Enrique Salas, spent 3 nights in the village studying soil conditions. He returned to the capital early, disoriented, silent. When asked why he left so quickly, he finally whispered, "It spoke to me." They asked what spoke. He replied, "The village." Reports started to surface. Journalists who tried to sneak in came back with static-filled recordings and photos that refused to develop. A radio technician said he picked up a low hum at 4:47, the same time the clocks had stopped in the village. When he turned the volume up, he heard something like breathing. Hoer Verde had become something else, not just a place, but a presence. Fog isn't just water and air. Sometimes it's a barrier. Between what is seen and unseen, between here and somewhere else. Locals began to tell stories of hearing footsteps in the trees at night, of glimpsing people standing motionless in the mist, only for them to dissolve when approached. Some said they saw the children of Hoer Verde, walking single file through the trees, smiling but silent. And always the fog would return, each morning. Same time, same stillness, as if something beneath it was watching, waiting. Years passed, the military pulled out. The government stopped speaking of Hoer Verde altogether. It was left behind, cordoned off with rusting fences and silent guards. But the village never truly stayed silent, not entirely. In 1952, nearly 3 decades after the disappearance, a group of amateur radio operators from a nearby town began experimenting with long-range frequencies. They were searching for distant signals, Morse code, airplane chatter, maybe even foreign broadcasts bouncing off the atmosphere. Instead, they found something else. At precisely 4:47 Ahmad, their receiver buzzed to life, a strange layered static, soft, rhythmic like breathing through a machine. Then a voice, faint, female, speaking in Portuguese, Esta escuro aqui. Por que esta tá escuro? It's dark here. Why is it so dark? Then silence. They thought it was a prank, until the same voice returned the next morning, same time. But this time it said, Voca pod nos ouvir? Can you hear us? The operators became obsessed. They built stronger antennas, recorded every signal, shared them with universities and local stations. But every time outsiders tried to tune in, there was nothing. The voice only came through their equipment, only in their town. Only at 4:47, a men technician described the experience as not like listening to sound, more like listening to someone else's dream. The transmissions grew longer. More voices began to join, sometimes whispers, sometimes screaming. But none of the recordings could be played back. The tapes would be blank. Every time. One night, one of the operators stayed alone in the station. He never came home. They found him the next morning slumped in his chair, radio still on. His notebook had only one phrase, scribbled over and over, "We're still here. We never left." After that, the group disbanded. The equipment was destroyed. The government quietly shut down any further public investigation. But the rumor remained that if you're near Hoer Verde and the air is still and the fog is thick, you can sometimes hear a voice through your radio calling from a village that no longer exists. His name was Elias Correa. He was not a scientist, not a soldier, just a wanderer, a former school teacher who had lost everything, his wife to illness, his home to debt, his will to grief. In 1971, at the age of 62, he walked alone into the woods with a single goal, to find the place where silence lived. Elias had heard of Hoer Verde all his life. The mystery intrigued him, not as a journalist, not as a thrill seeker, but as a man with nothing left to lose. He disappeared for 6 days, then he returned. He was found sitting on the edge of a dried-up riverbed, 30 kilometers from where the village once stood. His feet were torn, his clothes soaked, his face hollowed by fear, but strangely calm. When asked what happened, Elias whispered, "They're still there, but they're not alive, not like us." He was taken to a hospital and later to a psychiatric ward. Doctors dismissed his story, hallucination, trauma, sleep deprivation. But one nurse who sat with him during his final nights kept a journal. In it, she wrote the exact words Elias said before he stopped speaking altogether. They don't breathe. They don't blink. But they move. They whisper without sound. They look like us. But their eyes are empty, like rooms with the doors left open. He said he saw children playing the same game over and over, a priest repeating the same prayer, even when no one listened. Mothers standing in doorways, smiling, not blinking, as if time itself had stopped, but their bodies never knew. The village, he said, was still alive, but caught in something, stuck between the tick and the talk. Elias died 2 weeks later, his body shut down, but not from injury, from exhaustion, as if something inside him had never left the fog. Some believe he truly went there, that he walked into the eye of the mystery and returned with pieces of it still clinging to him. Others think he simply went mad. But either way, he is the only person known to have walked into Hoer Verde after the disappearance and made it back. And he never once asked to go again. It began with a dusty shoebox, In 1987, a Brazilian university professor named Marina Alcantara was cataloging archive materials from abandoned estates. Among crates of tax documents, wills, and family portraits, she found an unmarked box filled with photographs, black and white, old, worn by time, but strangely undamaged. There were no labels, no dates, no names. But what caught her attention wasn't the faces. It was the location. Each photo showed a village, wooden homes, small church, schoolhouse, jungle tree lines in the background. It was Hoer Verde before the silence, but that couldn't be possible. The government claimed no known photos existed of the village before the disappearance. No official census, no population record, no architectural documentation. Yet here it was, dozens of images, families smiling, children in uniforms, a priest holding up a handwritten sign that said, Festival, March 17th, the very week the village vanished. Marina, gripped by a mixture of awe and dread, continued sorting through the pictures, but then she found something else. Photos that were different. The lighting was wrong. The buildings were intact, but the people looked frozen. Their postures stiff, eyes wide, no expressions. And in every one of these strange photos, someone always in the background stood slightly apart from the others. A woman in a black shawl, unmoving, face blurred, body slightly out of focus, even when everyone else was clear. She appeared in 6 separate photos. Always in the shadows, always in the corner. And then one final image, the same woman, now in the center of the frame, facing the camera. Still blurred, still unrecognizable. And written on the back in old ink, Ella Limbra. She remembers Marina never submitted the box to her university. She left her position 2 months later, moved to a quiet coastal town, and lived the rest of her life in near solitude. But her niece later published a memoir where she described seeing her aunt standing on the shore at sunrise, holding a photo against the wind, murmuring to herself, "They're not dead, just forgotten." After Hoer Verde was officially abandoned, stories still trickled out, some from soldiers, some from curious travelers who ignored the warnings. But none were as strange as those tied to the schoolhouse. A plain wooden building near the center of the village, still standing, still quiet, but never empty. In 1994, a local journalist named Jorge de Moda set out to document the forgotten places of Brazil, ghost towns, empty roads, half-built cities. His final entry was meant to be Hoer Verde. He slipped past the fencing at night, carrying only a flashlight, a camera, and a recorder. He never published the story, but days later, he returned home, exhausted, sunken-eyed, trembling. His audio recorder was filled with silence, except for one section, a soft whisper, faint, crackling, then, in a child's voice, Senor Jorge, Voca Brinker, Mr. Jorge, do you want to play? He dropped the device, never listened again. He told only one friend, who later gave the details to a researcher. The sound had come, Jorge said, from inside the wall of the old schoolhouse. Others who dared approach the school told similar stories. Some heard laughter, some soft humming. A few claimed to hear pages turning, even though the books were long gone. One woman, a linguist named Talia Esteves, visited the site with the hope of transcribing whatever was speaking. She set up microphones inside the classroom, waited quietly. No breeze, no footsteps. Then a phrase came through her headphones, soft, repetitive, familiar. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 4 is... And then silence. She looked around. The room was empty, but one dusty desk, one of the tiny student desks, had a line carved deep into the wood. Still learning, still here. No one knows who carved it. No one knows when. But the wall of that classroom since then has been called by a name, a parade cue, Sisora, the wall that whispers. People say if you sit quietly beside it at exactly 4:47 a.m., you'll hear the sound of chalk against slate, a faint giggle, and a small voice asking, "Am I doing it right?" In 2003, long after the public had forgotten the name Hoer Verde, a quiet classified expedition was organized by a private contractor connected to the Brazilian Ministry of Defense. It was known internally only as Operation Verde 2. No press release, no announcement, no records. But something compelled them to go back. The team consisted of 6 individuals, 2 geospatial analysts, 1 atmospheric scientist, a linguist, a retired military officer, and a man whose identity was never revealed, simply referred to in documents as Observer X. They entered the village at dawn, equipped with high-resolution cameras, air monitors, and radiation sensors. The fog was already waiting. For the first hour, everything appeared normal, or at least abandoned. Same overgrown paths, same crumbling houses, same eerie stillness, until they reached the center of the village and the clocks. Every single clock, still intact, once again read 4:47 MN began ticking. By themselves. The team's video footage, later leaked anonymously, shows the moment clearly. All 6 standing frozen, eyes fixed on the ticking second hands. No wind, no birds. Just the sound of time resuming after years of stillness. Then static. The footage skips. Seconds are lost. The screen fuzzes, resets, and suddenly it's night. From full daylight to pitch black in an instant. They are all inside the church, breathing heavily. One whispers, "We saw them." Another says, "They were watching from the trees." Then the lens turns for just a second and captures the edge of the fog outside the window. And a figure, unmoving, featureless, dark, and then gone. The final frame of the footage is a shaky shot of the wall in the church. The original message, "There's no salvation," has faded, and been replaced by a new line, freshly burned into the wood. "You returned." But they never left. Only 2 of the 6 returned home. One disappeared shortly after, the other never spoke again. Only stared at walls and whispered one sentence over and over. We walked into a memory, and the memory knew we were there. Operation Verde 2 was officially denied, but the footage exists, archived in shadows, sometimes shown quietly at private gatherings of intelligence circles. A reminder that not everything forgotten stays gone, and not everything empty is truly abandoned. Years have passed, decades, and still, the name Hoer Verde stirs something in those who hear it, a strange familiarity, a pull, even among people who claim they've never heard the story. Some say they've seen it in dreams, a dirt road, empty homes, a cold fog, a child's voice in the distance, whispers behind a wall, a woman in a black shawl standing beneath a wooden sign, and always the clock, 4:47 a.m. Researchers in fringe science call it collective cognitive imprinting, the idea that powerful emotional events leave a trace in the human subconscious. That trace can spread, it can echo, and sometimes when the mind is quiet, it can rebuild itself inside a dream. People from around the world, who have never spoken to each other, have described identical dreams, a classroom with no teacher, a radio humming static in Portuguese, doors that open to the jungle, but never back inside. Some even described finding a note in the dream, folded and aged, with one sentence written on it, "You are remembering what wasn't meant to be remembered." The theory is simple and terrifying. Hoer Verde never stopped existing. It continues now as a living memory, drifting from one mind to another. A village that thinks, that waits, that dreams of itself through you. And when you close your eyes, You may walk its paths. You may sit in its empty chairs. Hear the soft tap of chalk on a board. Smell the bread still baking. And if you stay too long, you might forget that it was a dream. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, and if the air turns cold and the silence feels too quiet, and the clock reads 4:47 a.m., you'll know where you are. And maybe, just maybe, the village will recognize you too. Thank you for listening. You've just explored another file from Sleepy Mysteries, files to help you sleep. Sleep well. And remember, not all who vanish are truly gone. Some are simply waiting to be remembered again.